Greetings and good day, everyone. This is B back for another video. Now, some of you, mostly the people here from my Discord server, link in the description below if you haven't already joined, already know that I've been working on a TMNT AU for a while now. It's not connected to any prior incarnation or series of TMNT. It's an incarnation of my own design that takes inspiration from pretty much every past incarnation of the franchise. Fun! This includes the Mirage Comics, 1987 cartoon, 2003 cartoon, 2012 cartoon, Rise of the TMNT cartoon, IDW comics, you name it. Today I'm going to be talking about my version of the Turtles, April, and Splinter, and drawing them as I talk about them. Quick side note, some of this stuff is subject to change based on any feedback I get from people after I upload this video. We're going in order of age, starting with the oldest turtle and ending with Splinter and April, and then we'll be talking about my version of Mystic Powers a bit. Following that, we'll talk about how each canon iteration inspired this one. Hey, Editor B here. To explain the Minecraft gameplay that's playing in the background, drawing them and recording it at the same time on my laptop didn't work out. I had some technical difficulties, so here's some Minecraft gameplay instead. Sorry about that. Something I want to make very clear about this incarnation is that this is very much a found family story. The boys weren't mutated together and weren't all created by the same people. Another thing that's fundamental to this incarnation is that the turtles all have some kind of mystical element ability based on the mystic powers from Rise of the TMNT. Now, let's talk about the turtles. But wait, before we go any further, make sure to hydrate, eat, and just overall take care of yourselves. Now, let's get right into it, shall we? First up, we have Hamato Donatello. Yeah, he's the oldest in this incarnation at 16 at the beginning of the story. His inspirations are mostly Rise of the TMNT, although I did take a little bit of inspiration from the IDW TMNT comics. He is a spotted turtle, which is an endangered species of turtle, and his twin is named Slash. He was mutated at the same time as Donnie, and is a flattened musk turtle. He is best friends with April, although they don't always get along because he's into science and she can't stand the subject as a whole. Truth be told, Donnie is a mad scientist incarnate, although he struggles with this, and sometimes wonders if he actually likes science, or if he just feels like he has to like it. He's an extreme introvert for the most part, and would rather stay in his lab most of the time than interact with others, including his family. He cares very deeply about his family, but struggles with doing the right thing, and the actions of others especially don't always make sense to him. He has a tendency to believe that if he's not working, he's not being useful, so his blood is 90% energy drinks and coffee. He's also just heavily emotionally repressed in general, pretending like he doesn't care when he really does. Now let's talk about his creator and his twin for a moment. I don't have Slash's bio written up yet, so take anything I say here about him with several spoonfuls of salt. But essentially, Slash and Donnie were both created by a yokai known as Draxum, using the DNA of the human actor known as Lujitsu. He created them with the intention of making them into warriors, but Donnie isn't quite what he had in mind. He heavily favored Slash, and unless he wanted something from Donnie, he basically ignored him. In Draxum's eyes, if Donnie couldn't be the warrior he wanted, he was useless. Draxum is also the reason Donnie has cybernetic enhancements, which he can use to wield his mystic element abilities and hack into whatever he needs. His mystic element abilities are not naturally occurring, they were given to him artificially by Draxum. This was at an early age, but not so early that Donnie doesn't remember it very clearly. He claims that he had to make the turtle useful to him somehow, although Slash does not have cybernetic enhancement or mystic abilities. His mystic element is water, and was very likely the first turtle to gain access to his. Draxum was mentally and occasionally physically abusive to Donnie, and if he needed a test subject, well, Donnie was right there, wasn't he? He had the line of thinking that Donnie owed him for existing, and he made absolutely sure that Donnie knew that, both to make sure Donnie would never leave and was completely dependent on him, and out of frustration for Donnie not turning out the way he intended when he created him. In his mind, Donnie deserved it for being a massive disappointment. One thing I want to state about this iteration of Donnie before I go on is that he has autism spectrum disorder and severe dyslexia and is then diagnosed at the beginning of the story. He masks any neurodivergent traits and scoffs at the idea of doing anything for fun instead of working. He has to learn how to be a kid and learn that it's okay to express himself the way he wants. Some random facts about Donnie. He wears gloves and leggings to cover up his cybernetic enhancements since he feels self-conscious about them. He has a massive sweet tooth and loves sardines. His favorite sweet is salted caramel, but he also really likes Milky Ways. His favorite video game genre is fighting games, and his favorite game in that genre is Mortal Kombat, specifically Mortal Kombat Special Forces. He's unsure if Draxum's treatment of him is his own fault or not, and if he deserved to be abandoned by him or not. He understands Draxum is a terrible person, but he struggles to connect that with what he did to him being wrong. He loves snakes. In fact, he has a pet one named Anchovy. Next to Leo, he's the one who takes the whole ninja thing the most seriously. He likes fashion, specifically the cybergoth style. Next up, we have Hamato Raphael, who would be the second oldest at 15 at the beginning of the story, only a year younger than Donnie. He is an olive ridley sea turtle, which is a vulnerable species of turtle and is by far the biggest of the turtles size-wise. He is mostly inspired by Rise of the TMNT Raph, but also has some elements of 2012 Raph. He's the leader of the group, although he doesn't like being the leader, and often tends to unintentionally self-sabotage himself or missions due to anxiety or lack of focus. He's got anger issues, but never at his family or friends, but at the people who would try to hurt them. His anger issues were a lot worse before Splinter found him. Unlike the other turtles, Raph has no idea who his creator is, and that honestly kind of bothers him. He has a lot of questions about whoever they are, like, who are they? Do they love and care about him? Why was he created in the first place? Did they abandon him? If they did abandon him, why? I won't be sharing who his creator is here, due to it being incredibly plot relevant beyond just Raph's story, but what I will tell you is that shortly after being separated from his creator or creators, he ended up in the Hidden City and became part of a street gang of yokai. This was the period where his temper and anger issues were at their worst, to the point that his fellow gang members started calling him Angry Red. He really hates this nickname and tries to avoid being called it whenever he can. They would use him as a shield when doing robberies and other such things, and sometimes force him to do the robberies himself because of his sheer strength and natural mystic powers. Overall, Raph just never felt loved and never felt like he belonged anywhere. He was the third of the turtles to be adopted by Splinter, but Mikey and Leo had met Donnie before they met him. He initially refused to go with them, but after a reoccurrence of an odd dream that he'd had over and over throughout his life, he reconsidered their offer and went with them. Now, Raph is not the oldest in this incarnation. He's the second oldest. Despite this, however, he's still the leader. Here, Splinter let the boys choose among themselves who the leader would be, and Leo, Mikey, and Donnie chose Raph. Raph doesn't like being the leader. He has OCD and control issues, and that often leads to arguments with Donnie and Mikey. Now, Raph's element. His element is the power to control Earth, as well as anything growing in said Earth. Unlike Donnie, his mystic powers are completely natural, and he wasn't created with them on purpose. Someone found out that his creator was in possession of a mutant with mystic powers and did something to get Raph away from his creator. Raph has absolutely no memory of anything from before he ended up with the yokai gang he was raised with. Another thing that you should know about him is that he's trans and is openly so to his family. It's never treated as a problem or an issue or a burden, and is just treated as normal. His character arc would deal with discovering who his creator was, his relation with Mikey and Donnie especially. It'd also deal with his control issues and his leadership alongside Leo. Before we move on, I have some random facts I'd like to share about Raph. They are the following. He's afraid of heights, cripplingly so. Probably a phobia, to be completely honest. He loves swimming in baths and just water in general. He doesn't remember the ocean very well, but he does remember the feeling of being in it. He doesn't understand the point of video games or other similar entertainment, despite sometimes playing them with his siblings. He suffers from intrusive thoughts because of his OCD. Next up, we have Hamato Leonardo, the second youngest of the turtles at 14. This version of Leo is mostly of my own invention, but he takes a lot of inspiration from Rise and a bit from 2003. His species is Asiatic softshell turtle and has a metal covering he wears over his shell 90% of the time. He's impulsive and snarky around his family, but shy and distrustful around people he doesn't know well. He's selectively mute and uses ASL or writing to communicate to others. He hates it when others try to get him to talk verbally and will only do so if he feels 100% comfortable, which isn't often. He has an extreme lack of confidence, especially in his own abilities. He doesn't like talking about his feelings and is even worse about dealing with the feelings of others. Side note, he's absolutely the one to take the whole ninja thing the most seriously. The one to take it the second most seriously is Donnie. Now let's talk about his creator. He was imported from Asia by Baxter Stockman, who had already been involved in illegal and immoral experiments long before this. She had gotten her hands on a vial of the ooze, or mutagen, depending on who you ask, from somewhere, and wanted to experiment with it on something. So she took the baby soft-shell turtle and poured it all over his shell. She was not expecting what happened next. He mutated into a baby turtle that was basically on par with a human 2 to 3 year old child. He was raised in isolation in the lab for a few years, until the age about 9. One day, though, Baxter came back to the lab to find the place trashed and that Leo had escaped. She had left the security system deactivated out of arrogance. She assumed that Leo would never be able to escape even with it turned off. Clearly, she was completely wrong. Leo ended up wandering into the hidden city and was scooped up by some workers who worked for the two yokai who ran the battle nexus, Kumo and Juragumo, the twin spider yokai. Kumo had no interest in Leo, but Juragumo, on the other hand, she learned Leo was essentially a modern artificial yokai and immediately took an interest in him. So Leo was raised in the Battle Nexus for the next 5 years, being trained to fight and be an assassin. He was encouraged to be a silent killer, encouraged not to speak unless it was absolutely necessary, and even then it was discouraged. He fought in the Nexus most of the time, but when Jerkumo needed someone to disappear, that was Leo's job. That was the part he hated the absolute most, and the part he struggles with the most guilt about. At some point, though, Baxter came looking for Leo, demanding the Nexus return him to her. Leo had spent the last 5 years in service of Juragumo, believing he owed her for taking him in when he needed it. There was a massive fight between Baxter and Juragumo, ending in Baxter taking Leo away. Leo did manage to escape, resulting in Leo being lost in New York in the middle of the day. He ended up hiding in the sewers. This version of Leo has severe ADHD because of being overwhelmed and overstimulated, never having really been around others for an extended length of time before, and certainly never seeing other humans besides Baxter before. That's when Splinter found him and took him in. Leo was the second one of the turtles to be found and adopted by Splinter after Mikey. Leo's character arc would be focused on recovering from trauma and a possible co-leadership role with Raph, as well as his relationship with Donnie specifically. Editor B note here. I realized I forgot to mention his element here, and I couldn't find anywhere else to squeeze it in, so I'll just put it here. His element is lightning. And before we move on, we have some random facts to share about Leo. They are the following. He suffers from insomnia and nightmares, drinks a lot of coffee and soda, just anything with caffeine except for energy drinks. His ADHD is currently undiagnosed, but Donnie has a sneaking suspicion about it. His favorite video games are Street Fighter 2, Minecraft, Stardew Valley, and Adventure for the Atari 2600. He has over 100 hours in one specific Minecraft world. During confrontations, he tends to leap to the violent option first instead of thinking out other possible options beforehand. When in the lair, he tends to have headphones on to listen to music. It may take a bit to get his attention when he has them on. And finally, we have the final of the four main turtles, Hamato Michelangelo, the youngest at 13. Now, I know that I switched up the birth order of the other three main turtles, but I couldn't not have Mikey as the youngest, y'all. He's the baby of the family, and that's how it should stay if you ask me. Mikey here is mostly based on Rise, with some influences from 2012 and IDW. He's a Western painted turtle, and he's currently questioning what his sexuality is. His special interest is art, and the day his room or any room he's used is clean is the day Chicken Little is right about the sky falling. He's got a huge heart and would do anything to help people, especially his family, even if that person is a stranger or has hurt him in the past. Well, with one massive exception, but we'll get to that in a bit. He's not naive, but sometimes people assume his huge heart and kind nature are the same thing as him being dumb or stupid. He's actually quite independent for his age, and he hates it when people assume things like that about him. Another thing you need to know about this Mikey is that he doesn't take the whole ninja thing seriously at all, unless the circumstances are very dire, and will often laze about or joke around even if his brothers are training or enemies are afoot. Get it? Afoot? He doesn't take very many things seriously in general. His family getting hurt is the one big exception. People in general getting hurt, really. Now, Mikey's mutation was a complete accident. He was the pet of a child yokai, but one day a container of mutagen fell from seemingly nowhere and splashed on the baby turtle. Mikey was mutated, and the child panicked and instantly dragged Mikey to his parents. After some deliberation, they decided to turn Mikey over to the tribunal, the rulers of the hidden city, who were in need of yokai to serve them. At first, the tribunal were skeptical. What use could this little turtle be to them? But then one of them had a realization as he looked upon the young mutant turtle. Mikey had immense mystic potential within him, and as soon as Hisomi realized this fact, he convinced the other members of the tribunal to take Mikey in as an acolyte. From an early age, Mikey was trained by the tribunal in martial arts and to learn how to use his mystic element ability. Like Raph, he'd been born with innate mystic abilities, except his was far stronger. His element was fire, and there was more than a few times where he accidentally set something on fire during training. There was no love with his relationship with the tribunal, just rules and expectations. He felt neglected and unloved basically his entire childhood, and he was never allowed to actually fight anyone, just training, training, training. He was told all his life that he was one of the only things that stood between yokai kind and their prophesied destruction. Now, he doesn't remember this, and neither does Donnie, but they met briefly as children. Draxum's actions are fully supported by the tribunal, and he was giving them a progress update on Donnie and Slash's progress during this one meeting. Now, Mikey was the first one to be found and adopted by Splinter. He'd had enough of being the tribunal's tool and just straight up left when no one was looking. Because of Mikey's childhood and upbringing, he really cannot stand authority and people telling him what to do. To go back to the fact that he would help almost anyone. The tribunal is the one major exception to that rule. If anyone ever asked him to help the tribunal, he'd deny them on the spot. He'd never help the tribunal unless literally everything he ever cared about was at stake. Now, some random facts about Mikey. They are the following. He won't eat meat under any circumstances. He feels very weird about the idea of doing that. He has a pet cat named Clunk. Donnie named him. He's internalized some of the thoughts of other people about his intelligence, causing him to wonder if he is as stupid and naive as they say. Clunk is his emotional support animal. He has a bad habit of stealing minor or small items. Now, let's talk about Splinter, shall we? My version of Splinter is a Japanese raccoon dog, better known to some as a tanuki. I was originally going to make him a red-crested tree rat, but then I thought about the idea some more and decided against it. Splinter is not biologically related to any of the turtles and is indeed Hamato Yoshi. Splinter is an incredibly dedicated father to the turtles and would do just about anything to protect them from harm. He wants to avoid making his sons into weapons, especially Leo and Mikey, by any means necessary, even if it means he doesn't raise his sons traditionally and doesn't teach them the art of ninjutsu. He's told his sons that they can come to him about anything and he won't be angry and they won't be in trouble. He goes out of his way to spend time with his children, even if he doesn't understand their interests or if it seems like they don't want to interact with him right now. He won't force them, he just lets them know that the option is available to them. He spends a lot of time baking, a love that he shares with his youngest son, Mikey, and when he's not doing that or spending time with one of his children, he can usually be found watching K-dramas or listening to K or J-pop. He loves his children very much, and he's so glad he adopted them. However, all of that aside, Splinter has a bit of a dark and shady past. He gets irrationally angry or very quiet anytime the Foot Clan or Shredder is mentioned, and then tends to lash out at anyone around him, including but not limited to his children. He just thinks the past should stay buried in his case specifically. He grew up being taught the ways of ninjutsu alongside his adopted brother, who was known as Hamato Saki at the time. Saki had been adopted by the Hamato clan, one of the last ninja clans in Japan, at a very early age, and the two boys had been very close from the instant they met. They also grew up alongside a young woman known as Tang Shen. Tang Shen was not a Hamato, but her family had been close with the Hamatos for generations. As the three grew older, however, a rift started to form between Saki and Yoshi. Their father favored Yoshi, and this caused resentment to begin to grow within Saki's soul. Yoshi did not understand what had happened between them at the time, and because of this, their relationship started to go downhill even more, especially once their father began to get ill. Things began to get violent between them to the point that Tang Shen had to intervene. Yoshi eventually decided to leave and ignore his brother and focus on his relationship with Tang Shen, who he was about to marry. But then the two's father died, leaving behind the reveal of a massive secret. The two found out this revelation in a letter their father had left for them at the same time. It turned out that by birth, Saki was the son of a leader of the long destroyed Foot Clan, a clan that had a long standing rivalry with the Hamato clan once upon a time. His true name was Oroku Saki. Saki had been found abandoned by their father as a very young child, and he took pity on the child, adopting him as his son. Yoshi was confused and hurt that his father had kept this secret from him, and Saki just straight up disappeared for a few days after this revelation. Yoshi assumed that would be the last he ever saw of his brother, but he did have a conversation with Tang Shen about it. She basically told him if Saki truly cared about him as his brother, he would not let this get in the way. Sadly, she was soon to be proven wrong, incredibly wrong. About a week after the reveal of this new information, Yoshi came home to find Saki sitting in the middle of the floor of his house. Confused, Yoshi asked what Saki was doing there, but Saki said nothing. Then Yoshi looked around and noticed the blood on the floor and on the walls. He also noticed that Tang Shen was nowhere to be seen, and at that realization he felt his blood run cold. He turned to his brother, asking what Saki had done. At those words, Saki tossed a piece of bloody clothing to the floor, a piece of Tang Shen's clothing. He had killed Tang Shen. In a fit of pure rage, Yoshi attacked his brother. In the resulting fight, the house burned down and Saki was presumed dead. Yoshi was badly injured but managed to escape, and to this day, he cannot fully explain how he escaped with his life. Eventually, he made his way to New York, where he had a fateful encounter with what could be described as an odd human whose skin appeared to be metal. The odd being revealed itself to be a creature called a Krang, and took Yoshi prisoner to experiment on him. Over the next several weeks, he experimented on the man with the DNA of several different creatures from both Earth and other planets Yoshi had never heard of in his life. Eventually, Yoshi managed to escape, and to his horror, he had become a Japanese raccoon dog with some traits from other animals, but primarily a tanuki. He was horrified by his transformation and retreated into the New York City sewers, finding out about the hidden city soon after. He adopted his children one by one over the time that followed in this order: Karai, more on her in another video, Mikey, Leo, Raph, and Donnie. Now, one random fact about Splinter. He has heterochromia, one brown eye and one blue eye. This was the case even when he was human. And for our last character in this video, we have April O'Neil. April here is biracial, Irish American and African American. Her mom is black while her dad is white. She's incredibly brave on the outside, but on the inside she has a lot of fears and insecurities. She hides these behind a mask of bravery and an outward firecracker personality. She's very impatient, but she's not impulsive. She has a problem with being overly passive aggressive at times. She despises the Foot Clan and their way of doing things. More on that later. And sometimes when dealing with them, she can become irrational and blinded by her hatred of them. She's also incredibly forgiving and would do just about anything for those she cares about, even if they've done something to betray her or stab her in the back. In April's childhood, she was best friends with her next door neighbor, Casey Jones. They basically spent every moment of every day together, since Casey's home life was pretty bad. Casey's mom worked a lot and was a single mom. Well, rather, Casey's dad was in and out of their lives and was extremely abusive. But most of the time, his mom was a single mom. April's parents were divorced and Robin had left home, leaving April with no one she could count on but Casey, in her mind. Robin had left because of the situation at home and would be going to school for science. In April's kid brain, she was very young at the time, the subject was responsible for taking her sister away from her. Because their parents were absent so much of the time, the two ended up recruited by the Foot Clan. April was unsure at first, but since Casey was all for the idea, she went along with it as a result. They were mixed up with the Foot Clan and Shredder for years, even skipping school and committing crimes at points. But then something happened. I'm not sure what yet. I need to think about it some more to make April leave the Foot and stop talking to Casey completely. They haven't spoken a word to each other since that day. This was about 3 years before the start of the fanfic, which I'm going to be writing, of course. Now, some random facts about April, which are the following. She works for a pizza shop and helps the turtles get pizza that way. She's the reason they ever tried pizza to begin with. She's a pacifist at the start. Her favorite colors are green and red. She very much has abandonment issues. So there we go, my version of the Turtles, April, and Splinter. So next we'll be talking about how mystic powers work in this incarnation, because I want to lay out some basic ground rules for how it works for myself when I write the fic. Mystic powers are not the same as magic, although magic does exist, a bit more on that later, and won't just be able to do whatever the user wants. So, a few rules. Only yokai, type 2, and mutants can be born with mystic powers. but humans can learn to use them without being born with them. There are two kinds of mystic powers: elemental mystic powers, which are incredibly rare, and the more common type of mystic power, which is essentially alchemy. You can create just about anything if you have the right components. This one is more common, but it's less common to be born with it than the other kind. There's never been a human who's been able to use the elemental kind. Something I need to mention here is that there are two kinds of yokai: the kind from actual Japanese legend, and the kind that have only been around for a few thousand years. The second kind was born into being via mutation. As far as being born with it goes, there are three ways of that happening. One is to be born with mystic power due to genetics, since it's completely natural. Another is the possibility of a mutant or yokai being modified before or after birth to have mystic powers. This is seen as unnatural and cruel by most yokai. The third way is being born with it naturally at random, not due to genetics. This is very rare and usually results in extremely powerful abilities, and is almost always in the element category. The source of mystic power is the thing that originally created the yokai, type 2, in the first place, the Crying Titan. The Crying Titan is the remains of a Crying from thousands of years ago, from which Empyrean, or carrying blood, flows. It's essentially an unmodified form of the ooze or mugen that mutated the turtles in the first place. If a yokai, type 2, or mutant has mystic powers, and those mystic powers are of the element variety, at first they will not be able to summon their element from nothing when they're still inexperienced. There would have to be some form of their element in the surrounding area for them to use it. But as they become more experienced with their element, this becomes a non issue, and they can form their element from nothing, from thin air. When a mutant or yokai's type 2, mystic powers are given to them at an older age than before or slightly after birth, there is a major chance the subject's body will reject it at some point. This is incredibly painful for the subject, and there is no cure for this. Once the subject's body begins to reject the mystic powers, their body begins to break down from the inside out. This usually kills the subject within hours. Yokai, type 1, are completely exempt from any of these rules. Their abilities are magic and can basically do anything. There's no rules limiting the power of a natural born yokai type 1, except their own skill and power. If a yokai is incredibly experienced, and yokai type 1 can live for even longer than the first type, there's almost no limit to their power. The Ancient One is an example of this. Before I go today, the last thing I want to talk about is what incarnations inspired this, and in what ways. Rise. A lot of the world building Rise had, and stuff the writers wanted to do but never got to do, also it heavily inspired my version of the way this world works. I'd also say it heavily inspired my versions of all four of the turtles, but especially Donnie, Raph, and Mikey. Less so Leo, but he's still got a lot of Rise Leo in him. There's also a lot of Rise in the family dynamic, but there's also a lot of my own invention in there. Splinter from Rise also inspired my version of the character a lot, but in the sense that I decided to do something opposite from his character in that series in particular. But I did decide to include the boys calling Splinter Dad, because I love that and will forever love that. I'd also say my version of the Battle Nexus was the most heavily inspired from this version as opposed to 2003. And obviously Draxum comes from this incarnation, but he's very heavily changed in this incarnation, as you've probably already guessed, but still has some of the same motivations as Rise Draxum. The Krang in my incarnation takes the most inspiration from this one. 2012. I think the biggest takeaway I had for this incarnation from TMNT 2012 is this. My version of Mikey hates being called stupid and has a lot of self worth issues around that, and this version in particular inspired that idea. Another thing this version inspired is that none of the boys ever hit Mikey and they never call him stupid. Splinter never does that either. I'm extremely tired of that stuff happening in canon, so I decided, you know what? Screw it. I'm throwing that stuff out the window. Another thing this incarnation inspired was my version of Mona Lisa, but I think we'll talk about her some other time. A lot of Splinter's backstory in my incarnation was also inspired by 2012. Another thing is that my version of the Krang takes a bit of inspiration from this incarnation, especially one Krang in particular. I also want to use the brainworms from this incarnation and mine at some point. I think they gel super well with one idea I have. My ideas for Tang Shen were also loosely inspired by this incarnation. I'd also say that this version of Cry influenced mine quite a bit. 90s movies / 2007 continuity. I don't think I took a whole lot from this incarnation other than the fact that my version of the Foot Clan takes in troubled teens and orphans. Perhaps a little bit of how the 2007 movie handles mystic business, and I think this version of Cry inspired mine as well. Also, the existence of Night Watcher. 2003. The main takeaway from TMNT 2003 is the following. I was inspired by how Shredder, Chirel, in this show tried to trick Leon into citing him early on in the series to make it so that's how the turtles in this series meet Shredder. They wouldn't know who he is at first or how he hurt Splinter and Tang Shen. So for a very brief time, they'd side with Shredder or Rokusaki until something, I don't know what yet, will make it very clear that Shredder is a bad guy and is not to be trusted. Of course, this will be behind Splinter's back. That being said, I haven't figured out Shredder's motive for doing this yet. Another thing about my incarnation that 2003 inspired is that my version of the Battle Nexus also takes some inspiration from this one, despite primarily being inspired by Rise. I'd also say the tone of 2003 inspired mine quite a bit. I'd also say this version of Splinter inspired mine a fair bit. Ralph being a pacifist in my incarnation also came from this one, loosely inspired by this version of Donnie. Also, the Tribunal is in my incarnation, obviously inspired by the Ninja Tribunal from this incarnation. I'd also say some of how I characterize Yuichi in my incarnation comes from 2003's version of Miyamoto Usagi, but I'll talk about him some other time. 1987. The idea of Dimension X from this cartoon is something I'm going to be using in this incarnation. Other than that, not a whole lot, I don't think. Mirage Comics. You wouldn't be wrong to make the argument that the tone from my incarnation is similar to the Mirage Comics in a few places. IDW Comics. Various aspects of the Foot Leo arc and Casey's dad from IDW influence this incarnation. I might consider including Kitsune from this incarnation in my incarnation, but I'm not 100% sure on that yet. RG Comics. I don't think much of anything so far. Well, this script has gone on for way longer than I originally meant for it to, so why don't we close it off there for today? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below and have a great day, everyone. I love you all. This is B, signing off for now. Bye-bye!